This tutorial aims to only highlight the leadership qualities demonstrated by the leaders of different political parties to overcome the different challenges faced during the negotiation process. 3 question statements will be briefly discussed at the end of this video. In the essay, we will point out the following traits or attributes as was evidenced by the leaders' actions. The qualities demonstrated were foresight, determination or willpower, or tenacity or resolve, or perseverance, decisiveness, boldness or courage, commitment or dedication, strategic patience, compromise, negotiation skills, goodwill or good faith, pragmatism. The different challenges or obstacles to be referred to in this essay include, but are not limited to, violence and the related problem of political assassinations. The list of hurdles also include deep mistrust or distrust, ideological differences, the threat of the third force, disagreements and verbal fights, the threat of a civil war, doubt, and sabotage. The essay will be addressing the following question. Explain to what extent leadership, compromise, and commitment among different political parties in South Africa paved the way for a democratic South Africa in 1994. Support your line of argument using relevant evidence. We will start with our introduction. It is undoubtedly true and correct to a greater extent that leadership, negotiation, and compromise among the leaders of different political parties in South Africa paved the way for a democratic South Africa in 1994. It is the goal of this essay to outline how various leaders demonstrated leadership, negotiation skills, and compromise, as well as show how these to a greater extent cleared the obstacle-ridden way for democracy to be achieved. The surprise announcement by FWD Klerk on the 2nd of February 1990 of the unbanning of the ANC, PAC, and SACP, as well as the release of political prisoners, was a bold leadership move because he risked being seen as a sellout by the majority of whites. This demonstrated a leadership quality of having foresight. He had come to the realization that apartheid was no longer sustainable in the face of global and internal resistance. De Klerk foresaw that it was beneficial to negotiate now rather than wait when conditions were less favorable to push for whites' interests. As an act of goodwill, de Klerk released Mandela on the 11th of February 1990, as well as other political leaders such as Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada. This demonstrated decisive leadership, for he took the decision without consulting anyone. He knew that the negotiation would not be seen as fair if he was to negotiate with Mandela still being in prison. Releasing Mandela was a show of good faith and intent, which would entice Mandela to be willing to be in talks with the National Party. And indeed, Mandela showed up at the CODESA I on 4 May 1990 for talks. This demonstrates that indeed, to a greater extent, de Klerk's act of leadership opened the doors to negotiations, hence clearing the way towards democracy. The CODESA meeting on the 4th of May 1990, dubbed by historians as one of the talks about talks, aimed at getting to know each other's demands before formal negotiations. This was a show of good negotiation skills. This would then clear any misunderstandings. The ANC wanted immunity from prosecution for the returning exiles and the release of political prisoners, as well as the lifting of the state of emergency. The National Party, in turn, wanted the ANC to stop the armed struggle. At this point, leadership was seen in the leaders' commitment towards the removal of practical obstacles to negotiation and working towards the resolution of the existing climate of violence as seen in the CODESA minutes. Compromise was demonstrated by both leaders through the concessions made in the Pretoria minutes, which were produced on the 6th of August 1990. The ANC agreed to suspend the armed struggle, and the National Party agreed to free more political prisoners and lift the state of emergency except in KwaZulu-Natal. It is important to stress that arriving at such a consensus amid a backdrop of escalating township violence in Katlehong, Thokoza, Dobsonville, and Sebokeng on one hand, as well as the distrusts based on ANC suspicion of IFP being in collusion with the police force on the other hand, shows great commitment, resolve, and pragmatism of the leaders towards achieving peace and democracy, for they were not deterred by violence and distrust. This confirms the great extent to which leadership, compromise, and negotiation paved the way to peaceful ushering in of a new democratic South Africa. Nonetheless, obstacles still remained, which included the clashes between IFP and ANC supporters, the terror of the third force, and the doubt of the sincerity of the government. An example of such obstacles was the Sebokeng massacre on the 12th of January 1991, whereby 39 ANC supporters were killed at a night vigil while weeping the passing of Chris Nangalembe, an ANC leader of the Vaal region. It is in such an environment of violence that leadership and commitment was demonstrated in the signing of the National Peace Accord on the 14th of September 1991, which was a commitment from the different leaders of the 27 political and community organizations as well as homeland governments to end violence in South Africa and establish a multi-party negotiation. Although violence was not eradicated by the National Peace Accord and the Goldstone Commission, which was established by Klerk on the 24th of October 1991 to prevent public violence and intimidation, they helped to diffuse violence and tension and achieve relative peace. This demonstrates that largely it was leadership and commitment of those who signed the National Peace Accord that paved the way for formal negotiations to resume as the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA I, hence clearing the way for democracy. On the 20th of December 1991, CODESA I as the first formal negotiation started with 19 parties' leaders in attendance. The aim was to negotiate for reforms that would make a multiracial transitional government possible. Although the Conservative Party and the Pan-Africanist Congress boycotted, the IFP, represented by Frank Mdlalose and other leaders, signed the Declaration of Intent on the 21st of December 1991, which meant that they were to meet again at a later stage in order to change the political system. The break would also allow time for the ANC to mourn its members who had died during the Boipatong massacre. This showed leadership and negotiation skills, as they did not want the negotiations rushed. This was a demonstration of strategic patience. They wanted to allow for time to eliminate distrust and build confidence. The inclusive nature of the negotiations legitimized the process and helped to forestall future disputes. The slow pace and the break of CODESA I proved that all the leaders were pragmatic negotiators. During the period between CODESA I and CODESA II, the National Party lost 3 by-elections to the Conservative Party, and de Klerk's leadership is seen in him holding the whites-only referendum on 17 March 1992. De Klerk wanted to check if whites supported negotiations with the ANC and negotiated reforms. This was a big risk, as the continuation of negotiations rested on the outcome of the referendum. On the other hand, it was necessary as a leader not to be seen as acting in his own accord or alone. At this point, Mandela showed exceptional leadership and compromise as he rose above personal differences and mistrust of de Klerk and went out to campaign on behalf of de Klerk, pleading for the white community to vote yes in favor of the negotiations, and indeed, 68% of the whites voted in favor of negotiations to carry on. The leadership of Mandela and de Klerk was thus, to a greater extent, a show of willingness to engage for national interests and determination to advance democratic interests. CODESA II followed and planned for a multiracial government. CODESA II failed first because of the Boipatong massacre of 46 ANC supporters at the hands of IFP members brought in by government in police cars. In this regard, Mandela openly accused de Klerk of being complicit in the attacks. Secondly, the National Party and the ANC could not agree on issues of power sharing. Whereas the ANC wanted majority rule, The National Party wanted veto power for the minority National Party. Mandela, ANC leaders, and the alliance leadership of CODESA II walked out of the negotiations threatening rolling mass action, which made with the tragedy of the Bisho massacre in September 1992 after a march aiming to have CISK incorporated into the new South Africa. The failure of CODESA II threatened the goal of achieving a peaceful transitioning towards a democratic South Africa. However, the deadlock or stalemate was prevented. Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, representing the ANC and the National Party respectively, demonstrated great resolve and commitment as they continued negotiating in secrecy. Their mature leadership made them come to the realization that each party could not exclusively secure its demands. Hence, a compromise was reached, and an agreement between Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer was made. On the 26th of September, they signed a record of understanding. This made provisions for a constitutional assembly, an interim government, and their commitment to restart the negotiation process after the failure of CODESA II. It ensured negotiations continue in spite of township violence and the third force. This is evidence enough to show the great extent to which leadership, negotiation, and compromise laid the way for the birth of a democratic South Africa. Leadership and compromise was demonstrated in November 1992 by Joe Slovo when he proposed the Sunset Clause to break the impasse. This practical solution allowed for the creation of a government of national unity and the protection of whites' jobs for a fixed period of 5 years. Thus, the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum opened in 1993 to create a government of national unity and an interim constitution. However, the drafting and the negotiation process of the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum was threatened by the nationwide mass violence in response to the assassination of Chris Hani. The fact that Mandela went on national TV to appeal for calm shows his leadership quality characterized by a commitment to a peaceful achievement of a democratic South Africa. This was an act of negotiating with the masses so as to avoid a civil war. Mandela demonstrated leadership by negotiating with the masses, and the fact that the nation listened to him shows that many saw him as a befitting leader. A number of violent incidents also threatened to destabilize the peace process. A few months after the assassination of Chris Hani, there had been an attack on St. James Church by 4 Azanian People's Liberation Army members on 25 July 1993 in Cape Town. On 31 December, 3 EPLA operatives opened fire on the crowd in the Heidelberg Tavern. These acts of violence included the AWB storming of the World Trade Center in Kempton Park and the intimidation of delegates of the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum to sabotage the process. Here leadership was demonstrated when negotiations were made with Eugene Terreblanche, promising him that no one will be arrested for the incident if they walk away. Another incident was the attack on Shell House, which was the ANC headquarters, by IFP gunmen. The ANC leaders responded by showing restraint and not retaliating as they were close to completing the negotiations. Prior to the storming of the World Trade Center, the police had had a violent clash with the AWB in what became known as the Battle of Venterstop. The fact that this was the first time the police had used brutal force against whites shows the greater extent to which Klerk was willing to go, and a show of how he was committed to ensure peace as well as ensuring a successful transition to a democratic South Africa. It is conclusive from the above given arguments that the antagonism made the leaders even more obliged to keep on negotiating, even though the process was punctuated by breakdowns or troubled by mutual accusations of treachery. Instead of allowing violence to derail the negotiations, the leaders saw it as something to help them be pushed towards agreement on contested issues. They opted for compromise rather than the alternative, civil war. Their success is seen in the setting of an election date, the creation of a government of national unity, and an interim constitution which was praised as the most democratic and progressive in the world. And indeed, on the 27th of April 1994, elections were held with ANC emerging as the winner. To conclude this video, let's briefly look at the following essay question. Nelson Mandela was single-handedly responsible for the coming of democracy to South Africa in 1994. Do you agree with the above statement? Use relevant evidence to support your answer. Having the knowledge of the fact that the coming of democracy to South Africa was a negotiated settlement, together with our understanding of the compound word single-handedly to mean alone, solely, or by himself, it gets to be easy to see that the statement is not true, if not outrightly ridiculous. Our introduction will be something like this. It defies logic and common sense to say that Nelson Mandela alone brought democracy to South Africa in 1994. It is impossible for one man's efforts without the help of others to bring democracy. Mandela did not negotiate alone. It is therefore the aim of this essay to look at the role played by Mandela as well as the role played by key political figures who were part of the negotiation process between 1990 and 1994. Our stance would have been different if the statement was, Nelson Mandela played a significant role during the political negotiations between 1990 and 1994 to bring about a democratic South Africa. And in response, we would have written our introduction agreeing with the statement by saying, it can easily be agreed that Nelson Mandela played a significant role during the political negotiations between 1990 and 1994, which brought about the birth of a democratic South Africa, although he did not do it alone. This essay will focus on the roles played by key leaders of different political organizations, including Mandela, during the negotiation process. Lastly, let's look at what is expected of the following question. Explain to what extent political will and determination of leaders from various political parties during the negotiation process led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. Although there is no mention of challenges in this question, they are still needed in the essay for us to be able to clearly highlight the willpower and determination the leaders demonstrated in the face of the to-be-mentioned obstacles.